Hi, my name is Robert Chelle with Chelle Law, and I'm an attorney that assists veterinary associates with employment contract and independent contractor agreement issues. Today I'm going to talk about veterinary non-compete basics. So, what are some of the things you need to think about when you're signing a contract that contains a non-compete and some definite red flag areas? So, the first thing when analyzing a non-compete in your contract will be, are you in a state where they are enforceable? So there are a handful of states where non-competes are not enforceable at all. The vast majority of states still allow them to some degree, depending upon whether they're reasonable or not. And I'll get into what is considered reasonable. But that would be the first thing to do, is identify, are you in a state where they are enforceable or not? More and more states are starting to either restrict, limit, or outright ban non-competes. Many states have started with physicians, have not extended those to other professions yet. But my guess is in time, it will start creeping in to most of the states where there'll at least be some restrictions on, like in Texas, for instance, with physicians. They instituted a 1-year cap on non-competes, and then I believe it's 10 miles from their primary practice location. That's probably where it's going to head at some point, even in the conservative states. All right, so there are 3 components of any non-compete. You have the scope, meaning what can't you do during the restrictive period, how long it lasts, so what is the temporal restriction, and then what is the geographic restriction as well. So what can't you do for how long in a certain geographic area. So let's take each part one by one. So what the scope is relatively important for a vet, especially if you're doing urgent care, emergency medicine at a hospital. You want to make certain that the non-compete is specific to what you're doing for that employer. So if you're working in an emergency veterinary hospital, you want the scope to be you can't work in an emergency veterinary hospital within 10 miles for 1 year. You want options during the restricted period. And so if you can't work in an emergency hospital, then you could do urgent care, or you could do a small animal, vet-owned clinic or something like that. You just want to have different options. And then the same thing, if you're working in a small animal clinic, you don't want the scope to say you can't practice veterinary medicine for 1 year. You want the scope to say you can't practice in a small animal veterinary clinic for 1 year. And then you could at least do maybe some relief work in an urgent care or emergency medicine until you get through the 1 year period. So that's the first thing, is make certain the scope is, I guess, beneficial to the vet. Next, as far as time, I always advise no more than 1 year. Nearly all the states acknowledge that 1 year is a reasonable amount of time. If you see a non-compete for 2 or 3 years, that's much too long. So this is a pretty simple one, except no more than 1 year. Next, the geographic restriction. This is the one thing that can change depending upon where you are. Meaning, if you're in New York City, a reasonable, geographic restriction could be a block or 2. Whereas if you're in a rural environment, maybe 15 to 20 miles, and which will most likely knock out any potential jobs in that area anyway. So let's say you're in a larger city, and I would say no more than 5 to 10 miles from your primary practice location. Now, the tricky part is if you're working for maybe a corporate veterinary practice or a larger, maybe small vet-owned practice where they have multiple locations in a city, you want to make sure the language doesn't say that you can't work within 10 miles of every clinic that they own, but the clinics that you work at, and more specifically the clinic, singular, of where you provide the majority of your care. Some places will have, ship you around to different locations. If they let's say they have 5 locations in a city, You don't want language that says it attaches to anywhere that you've worked, because potentially, let's say you work for an employer for 8 years, and in year 1 you worked at one location for a day or two. Well, you don't want to be restricted for 10 miles from one location that you worked at 8 years ago. So the look back period should be about a year, meaning anywhere that you've worked in the last year, nowhere beyond that. And it should be limited to one, at the most 2 locations, where you're providing care. This can be the most important thing that we negotiate on behalf of the veterinary associate, especially if somebody grew up in an area, have family in an area, raising kids, they go to school. Like, the last thing they want to do is have to move or drive a significant amount of time to get to a new job for a year. This is negotiable. If an employer says, sorry, we can't make any changes, then you may just have to move on and find another position that will allow you to have a reasonable non-compete. For anything in a contract, it is negotiable. It's based upon leverage, whether you can get what you want. And so at some point, either if they say, no, we're not doing anything, then you have to be willing to walk away and then move on. So, all right, that's a little bit about veterinary non-compete clauses. If you have any questions about an employment agreement or independent contractor agreement, feel free to contact my law firm at the information listed below in the description. And I appreciate you watching the video. All right, thanks. Bye.